looking at how to communicate about what I see as one of the very most important issues facing Vermont right now. And what I'm going to do is kind of give you my view of where this nests in our priorities as an administration, as a leadership team, as a state, and then pass it to Michael, who's going to show you a PowerPoint so that you understand why we think this is such an important issue facing Vermont, and some more details. And then you're going to hear from different members of the leadership team who have taken ownership on convening internal stakeholders, internal staff and external stakeholders, to think about how we can drive towards some solutions starting in this next session. But the idea is that we're going to start a dialogue which will hopefully lead to some real solutions in the coming years. So where I start with this is thinking about climate change, because as you all know, that's the issue that I spent a lot of time thinking about in this job and actually even at home. And you know, I have Michael whispering over my shoulder, and 5 years ago he said, you know, Deb, it's all about the forests. You think about water quality, well, really, it's really all about the forests. And I guess after that many years, like, I recognize he's absolutely right. You know, when we think about what will make Vermont resilient to climate change, and the challenge we face with climate change is it's happening, but we don't quite know what the it will be, right? Any past models aren't going to be helpful. It's looking forward. There's lots of different ideas of what we could see with climate change, but we're operating at a time of uncertainty, and that uncertainty impacts how we think about protecting our communities, our economy, and our ecosystems. Like, we're not quite sure what's going to happen, how fast, who's going to adapt, who's, you know, in terms of species, what species can adapt in place, what species are going to migrate to some place that's more friendly to, you know, what their needs are. We're not quite sure what it's going to mean for our communities. We do know that we're going to have more intense rainfall. We do know that we're going to have more precipitation, which might mean more ice storms. First more snow, ultimately more ice storms, and that will be a hazard for us. We do know that we'll have hotter, drier summers, and that might mean more vulnerability to forest fire. We don't know when it's all going to happen, you know, at any given time. So we want to be prepared. We also know that we want to make sure that we're doing our part to contribute to reducing global climate emissions. And we've got this wonderful forest that can act in large part as a carbon sink. How we manage the forest, our forests in Vermont, is going to be so important when we think about Vermont's contribution to greenhouse gases and climate change and carbon pollution, and whether or not we can be a place that is able to not just think about renewables, think about conservation, think about conversion to zero-emission vehicles, all these things we're doing, but also think about the natural infrastructure we have in place. How do we preserve it in a way that maximizes our positive contribution? So in thinking about forests, the reason why we as a leadership team are so focused on forest health and integrity at this time is because we are at a moment in time where they are uniquely at risk. And for folks of you who don't work with landowners, forest landowners, you wouldn't realize that, you know, Vermont, and correct me if I get the numbers not quite right, but we're about 79% forested. We're losing some forests, but 79% still pretty darn good. And but of that 79%, is it 60% is in private? 75%
and 85% of that is privately owned.
Okay, good. Thank you. See, that's why I have them here. So I didn't get it quite right. So we're down to 75%. When I started, we were saying 79. Now we're saying 75% because we've lost forest. So we've got 75% of forest. Of that, 85% is owned by families, as opposed to like corporations. And of that group, 70%?
Yes.
Is 60 years old and older. So if you think about it, we've got this huge group of landowners who are getting ready to retire. We're getting ready for generational transfer of that property. And, you know, we've done a really good job with our farmland. We've got programs working with landowners to preserve our farms and our ag soils, thinking about generational transfer. And how do we do it so that we maintain our iconic landscape with the farms? We have not done that with forest landowners. And it's complicated because unlike farms, where it's also the homestead in many cases, people live there. It's not just your job, but it's also, you know, your home. Very often forest landowners, well, more and more forest landowners are living somewhere else, right? This is just an asset they hold. And the challenge, of course, is that as these folks are retiring or as they are passing on the land to the next generation, there's tremendous risk that it not be kept in forest, or that there's a long driveway going into an interior forest block. They build a house, you add a cat and a dog, and all of a sudden you no longer have the ecological services that forest land used to provide. Not only that, it also stops having economic value because it's hard to log, it's hard to sell those logs when you have lots of little parcels. You're going to hear a lot more about that from the real expert, Michael, and others. So this is significant. The time is now to start addressing it. And so we've made this a top priority. And, you know, we've got the water quality stuff happening. That's not off of our, for all of you getting nervous about this, we can do more things at once. We're rolling out solid waste. But in terms of what we as a leadership team are looking at together now is how do we move an agenda to begin to protect forest health and integrity for future generations? Because if we don't, if we just let it go, then we're at really a tremendous risk. Because even if the land is just subdivided now, it makes it harder to log, it makes it harder to get economic value, which means it makes it much more likely that a landowner will have some incentive to sell it for a house, for a lot, and develop it. So that's the framing for this, why we care. What we've done as a leadership team is we actually broke up into 5 different groups led by different folks, and you'll hear from them. There's a subgroup looking at conservation solutions. How can conservation play a role in protecting forest health and integrity? You'll hear from Billy Koster, who's with me leading that section. We're looking at outreach and education. You know, how do we educate landowners and communities about what the issues are and what the opportunities are, and that's being led by Kim. There's a regulatory arm that's being looked at by John with some help from Billy, and then landowner incentives. You know, are there ways to create incentives to keep forest in meaningful blocks? And that's being led by Trey and Lewis together. And then support for the forest economy, because we recognize that we're not going to keep forests unless they're going to, in some way, provide some sort of economic benefit to the landowner. You're paying taxes on it. You know, how can you make sure that it's worthwhile, just as worthwhile for the landowner to keep the forest as it would be to sell it for development? And Mike Snyder is leading that conversation. Know that Mike and his team did a great job teeing this issue up last year. They did an amazing job in front of the legislature. I was shocked by how much buzz it has created. It's like dropping it. They didn't drop a pebble into the pond. They threw a boulder into the pond, and there are these ripples so that folks, a lot of people are talking about it. Even folks that sometimes I find surprising, like the Vermont Community Foundation. They oversee a lot of Vermont's philanthropy. They added this to their list of, I think it's the top 10 issues facing Vermont. You know, the future of our forests. So that's really great because, you know, when you fly over Vermont, what do you see? Trees, right? A lot of trees. And so it doesn't look like we're having a problem. And I'll tell you, that's part of the issue that we're facing here, is when you fly over the state or when you drive the roads, it's hard to see that there's a threat there. And for all of you who are here, you know you're the opinion leaders on all things environmental with your friends, right? Like people come to you and say, what should I think about this or that? And so even if you have no background in forestry, pay attention here and help articulate to your circle why this really matters, so people understand that even though it looks like all's good, we're really at a time when we need to act to protect our forested landscape. And it's not just about a carbon sink, right? You know, it's the forests protect water quality because it slows down the rainfall and it prevents erosion. Right? So it's flood resilience, it's water quality, it's protecting our communities, right, in the same way, not just its direct climate impact. So it's the package, and you'll hear about it for yourself from Mike Snyder. So let's welcome Mike.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks all for being here. I'm really happy to see you. And so forest fragmentation, Deb made the point, it's a lousy name. So we've been struggling. Well, how do you communicate this? There's some really compelling points and pieces. We'll talk about those, but as a kind of a marketing scheme, if you will, or a slogan, it is a challenge. I myself, we're thinking about how do you put something out there, what do you call it, so as to generate interest and enthusiasm and get people involved. And so I'm thinking maybe calling it free beer might be but you can see that's probably not going to happen, and so we could use your help with that. I am going to give you, I'm going to show the PowerPoint presentation that I used to present our fragmentation report to the legislature. I've made it a little shorter for a number of reasons. One of them is that, with due respect to Rebecca, used to be in the legislature, I thought you folks don't need so many slides, right? That I could slim it down, you'd get the point, and many of you, that's the other piece of this, my way of introduction is, I've given this presentation many times. I feel like some ways I've been giving this presentation since I was in middle school. Those of you know me, I'm quite interested in forests, and but I'll admit, and I've said this to many of you before, that this is actually a little more challenging for me because of who you are and your work and your personal interests, as Deb has alluded to. So I'll give it my best shot here. But so the idea is, this is the presentation given to the legislature as kind of a summary of our 60-something page report that we were required to give. I'll jump right into it then. So in April, I made this presentation, and it was a joint hearing of 5 committees of jurisdiction and a bunch of onlookers. And as Deb said, it really was, it's enormously gratifying that it was extremely well received. I didn't really know what to expect. They were very busy. There were some pretty contentious issues. This was getting towards the end of the session. And like, really, forests? And who is this guy? And there's trees everywhere. So that it went well and beyond the presentation, that people are interested, is really important. And it says a lot about our collective mission and our work, that Vermonters of all stripes seem to be interested. Before I begin, I want to, I've received a lot of attention and credit for this, as well on behalf of the department. I really like to do some backflips here to make it clear that this isn't me, this is us, and that the report itself was a group effort, and the presentation in particular, I had a lot of big help. So recognizing we had a kind of a core team of participants from the agency, but we also had additional help from folks outside the agency and other agencies of government. And I really want to make special recognition for Alex in the Forestry Division, and Alex Pastor and Danny Fitzko, who were enormously helpful down at crunch time, putting the document together, and Danny with a stroke of brilliance helping me build this PowerPoint presentation. So a group effort, really. Forestry, forest parks and recreation, Fish and Wildlife have been unbelievably helpful to this. Even before this really was on the radar screen, biologists at Fish and Wildlife were working on these concepts with forest habitat block analysis and others, and I'm really grateful for that. It is, I'm into this stuff for sure, but it is to me a huge honor to be the commissioner of this department in this agency with these people at this time. And this has been an opportunity for all of us to see this, as what I always say is that forests really truly are the great integrators of environment in a place like the Northeast. And so it really is a special honor, and thanks for being interested. So my plan here is that what this is a little bit of how we got here, what the report, a summary of the report, and where we think we're going from here. In 2014, the legislature saw a bill introduced in the Senate, S-100, Senate Bill 100, an act relating to forest integrity. I submit to you that that's historic. I don't think those two words have ever appeared in the General Assembly before, forest integrity. Why did that happen? Well, interestingly, I think it's fair to say that it came forward as a bill out of concerns about industrial ridgeline wind development. I don't think there's any question about it. And so, and some were smart enough to say, well, let's look at that, and forest integrity. So that immediately meant what? It meant that people are going to freak out, one side or the other, really for it or really against it. And so, and that's indeed what happened. So S-100 became very contentious in committee, and I testified on behalf of the agency and thanked the committee for their interest in forest integrity, and then pointed out that there were a lot of really serious unintended consequences of the mechanisms that they were proposing. Changes in Act 250 that were increasing jurisdictional opportunities and really triggering some new triggers. And so that such, for example, we said, you know, this would mean that to forest openings, patch cutting, landings, recreational trails, they would now be subject to an Act 250 permit. If they were, so any human-caused perturbation in the canopy over 10,000 acres, regardless of ownership, would trigger Act 250. And we pointed out that that really was not workable, and many others did as well. So the short of this is that that bill somehow managed to not die, and instead passed through the Senate and the House and was signed into law by Governor Shumlin as Act 118, and what it had was findings. The findings said Vermont's forests are really important, and we strengthened those findings by saying they're important, yes, for habitat, biodiversity, connectivity, but also for human use and economic development, and made this case that forests matter, that Vermont is, you could say, forest strong, and that fragmentation and careless land use decision-making threatens the values of forests. That's really significant. And then it gutted everything else in the bill and landed with the commissioner of FPR will report back next winter, January 15, with a report on fragmentation, saying, you know, what are the current, what's the current status and projected trends in fragmentation and forest land use patterns, and what are the suite of policy options that should be considered to support forest integrity and thwart forest fragmentation. So that's what we did. So that's what the bill became as law, and we now have this responsibility to report back. Fast forward, again, a whole team of us, interdisciplinary, worked on ideas. What we did was then craft this report, and I went and presented this. And really, just running through the report, basically what we do is, as I always like to do, is we began with the forest. We said the forests of Vermont, we have just a very short overview of the extent of forests, 4.5 million acres of forest land or thereabouts, third or fourth most forested state in the country. Indeed, we are forest strong. We make some basic descriptions of the forests of Vermont. What are they? How are they constituted? And then we delved into some of the more human aspects of our forests. So we make the case, really, right up front, what our forests are, and that they are indeed a biological community. It's not just a bunch of trees. That forests, as I like to say, forest is more a verb than a noun. It's about what forests do. They are not static. They are marked and defined by variation and dynamism. Even if we don't do anything with them, they change. And they're endlessly fascinating in that regard. They're varied and they're dynamic. And that it becomes very important to, if you're going to think about forests, land use, and people at all, you need to accept that right from the beginning. So think forest as verb less than noun. It's also important to realize that our forests of today are an expression, among other things, they are an expression of their past. And they have been here since the last glaciation, so we're talking something 10,000 years of forest development. And we make the case that forests are the original native Vermonters. It is our natural state. It is our native condition, forest. Okay? And that's the reference condition. But it hasn't always been thus. So we took a look back, and I'm using the Harvard Forest dioramas, these artist renderings that sort of depict a generalized view of New England's landscape history. And it works well for Vermont's landscape history as well. So beginning with pre-European settlement, Vermont was forest, heavily forested, in a complex old forest structure. And then over time, people happened, more people. Natives interacted with this landscape, but in a very small way, largely around water bodies, rivers and lakes, etc. And otherwise it was heavily forested. So then we have clearing for agriculture. This is our basic land history. I think most of us know it. It's important to point it out. By the mid-1700s, most of Vermont was cleared for subsistence agriculture in particular. And so we had then maybe 15 or 20% of the landscape was in trees, and the rest of it was not forest. Then owing to many changes in this country, particularly westward expansion, urbanization, after the Civil War giving vets access to free land in the Midwest, when Vermont hill farmers, who had spent their lives beating themselves against hills and rocks, when they heard there was like 30 feet of topsoil in Iowa with no rocks and it was free, they thought, I think I'm going to try farming there. And so there was this massive migration away from Vermont's forest, this so-called farm abandonment, and by the middle of, that really was heightened about the middle of the 1800s, where once again the forest returned to trees, and we've learned a lot about the patterns of succession and how vegetation recovers. And we've seen this and we've learned much from it. The point here is that it was cleared heavily, at least once, probably a couple of times, and then regrew to forest. Cleared, regrew to forest, to the point where in these certain patterns, again, we've learned from them, but the point is we've recovered pine and hardwood, leaving us to where we are today. Again, heavily forested, with really a relatively small fraction developed and a significant piece of our landscape in agriculture. And that leaves us, that's kind of where we begin, is with that history, we've come to this. And I show the historical slides to just deal with up front an issue that comes up every time we talk about this, which is, again, relax, Snyder, there's trees everywhere, and we've cleared this place a couple of times before, and what happens? Forests happen. So what's the worry? Well, I would submit to you we need to deal with that right up front, that, well, are you confident that we can do this again? Well, the way we're changing forests and converting forests to not forest is much different than what we did then. The pace, the rate, the tools, the purposes. This is now going to built infrastructure as opposed to subsistence agriculture. So I just want to clear that up right up front. We are aware that we've cut this forest before. We should be amazed by its resilience and the way it can rebound, but we should not be thinking that anything goes and we can count on that happening again. So we just dispel that one right off the top. And then we get to, well, we're 75% forested, so is there a problem? Again, I want to be clear, this is not, our credibility is at stake. We're not saying the forests are disappearing overnight. What we're saying is, let's look at this. And we are heavily forested, and things are in generally good shape. But there are numerous significant unsettling trends. Ecological trends like failure of regeneration. That's the new seedlings being initiated in the understory. Increased rates of mortality and dieback in our forest canopy, owing to many stresses. Invasive plants, outcompeting native plants. Invasive organisms like emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid, Asian longhorn beetle. There are many pressures and unsettling trends about the health and condition of our forest. And what we've noticed from repeated systematic inventory and tracking is that for the first time in about 150 years, we are losing forest, as Deb mentioned. That we have practiced forestry and land use decision making in a relatively low stakes environment for a century and a half. That is, we've enjoyed an degrading forest landscape. It's just basically been growing and accumulating, both in area and in the size and ages of the trees, until now. And so we're at this tipping point. Not that, oh my God, the sky is falling, but that this is an interesting thing, given these ecological trends, and now given this land use pattern that we're starting to lose forest land, that we're signaling it's probably time to take stock and understand what are the values of these forests, and are we okay with this trend? And are there things we should do about it? Okay? So that's the basic premise for the fragmentation report. Beyond just the numbers of trees, the number of acres of forest, as I said, we have to look into the people side of this. And that's where it actually gets really complicated. I've always said forests are amazingly complex and mysterious and complicated, but they're the easy part. It's the people that are tricky, and we've got more and more of them. And so let's own forest predominantly. Why does that matter? Well, because people all have different needs, different interests, different values, different goals, and that spreads the ownership decision-making over many, many, many people and raises many challenges. And it also means the fate of any given piece of forest land is in someone else's hands. And we need to, it's both a challenge and an opportunity for us. So we look at that. And that gives us the snapshot of where we are, which is largely a green forested state, largely privately owned, with some significant public land in the mix. This is where the data in our report starts to get interesting. I'll point to two basic features of this slide: area of owners, acres and numbers of owners of Vermont's forest land. And really, it's there's two pieces that I call your attention to. This one here is green is the number of owners, orange or whatever is the area of forest land. What this component of the slide is telling us is parcelization. We're having increasing numbers of owners. All right, so that means there's the same amount of area, but it's being owned by more people, and that means there's smaller and smaller pieces of ownership, right? That's parcelization. We'll get to that a little bit further later. This is the second piece I'll draw your attention to, which is the area. This a significant portion of Vermont, the majority of Vermont's land, the area, is owned by people 65 years and older. An aging demographic. So increasing numbers of parcels and an aging demographic. Combine those and we have a significant threat to the future of Vermont's forests. Why? Because we don't like or trust old people? Why does this matter? It's not that. I plan to be an old person someday. So
Some would argue you're already.
fair enough. Where's my cane? So no, the point is that there's this crux in their life where decisions get made, and it's this intergenerational transfer of are we sure that land area is going to stay in forest? And the answer is no, not at all. In fact, there's many threats and many indications that as people approach this point, they need to sell, they need to subdivide, and there's this almost complete lack of estate succession planning. Ideas about how to do it. It becomes an emergency situation, and what we're seeing is even families who have been on the land for generations, they get to a point now where the owners that are left on the land, they have children, they're elsewhere, they may not want to come back, and even if they do, they may not be able to come back and take over the forest land. So instead what happens, it gets subdivided so it can be sold, and each of them can get a piece of the estate. And that's not good for the future of Vermont's forest. So we call out these two factors: increasing numbers of parcels, increasing age of our forest owners, and especially in this wildly disproportionate amount of private forest land. Interestingly, we also point out the sort of the culture and attitudes of these private landowners. That survey after survey shows that when you ask forest landowners, why do you own land? It's mostly about, when pressed, it's about home and privacy, aesthetics, maybe biodiversity, recreation, family legacy. And when you get to things like firewood, investment, part of the farm, timber production, it's way down the list when people tell you why they own land. And really what it all adds up to is this idea that we're mostly accidental forest landowners. This massive land base owned by private individuals and families, they bought a house, and it came with a back 40. And they're not even sure why they have it or what they do with it. So this is another component. The sort of attitude, the cultural values are changing. It's mostly owned by people who are not of the land, from the land, kind of with that tradition of working with it or stewarding it in some way. It's a changing demographic in this additional dimension, which adds to the complexity of the challenge. We look at the rate of land consumption and development. This is a horrible statistic that though we have a relatively low population and it's not growing a whole lot, but we're still consuming land and gobbling up and using land at a rate that so the rate of land consumption outstrips the rate of population growth. That is completely unsustainable. It cannot work that way. But that's what's happening right now. So we're using up land even when we don't have a growing population. So we've called that out and said, this is shown up repeatedly. Then you get into it and you say, many municipalities value local forests. And you look at their town plans, and many of them go on with their narratives about extolling the virtues. And we love the forested hillsides of our community, and we value them. Turn the page in their planning documents, and there's really nothing there that protects those values. They say it, people like it, they want to like it, they know they should like it, but they don't really act that way. And they're not putting anything in place to protect those forests in any way, or to show those values. So this is kind of a more disturbing kind of trend. We point those things out as kind of the backdrop to the forests of Vermont today. And then we spend a significant amount of time talking about the values and benefits that accrue to Vermont and society from forests. And we break them into a few broad categories of values and benefits of forests. Beginning with this broad category of the forest economy. And just saying right up front, this really matters. This is, it's a $1.5 billion annual economic engine. $1.5 billion of economic activity generated directly from forest industry. That's the wood-using industries. A significant employer, and outside of Chittenden County, still among the highest manufacturing wages in the state. So in rural Vermont in particular, it's foundational. It's a bedrock to the local rural economy, this forest economy. And so this is a little bit counterintuitive, I accept, but we really need to get past that counterintuitively. That is that we're going to save forests by cutting trees. But that's exactly what we think. And that's actually, in 2015, kind of our last best hope, really, is that we need, Deb did a really nice job of explaining this, it's about economy. And we need to be able to work with forests in order to keep forests forest. Landowners have to have an economic ability to pay the holding costs of the land. And if they don't, then that's an incentive to start subdividing. That's the way they can make money from their land. And for many landowners, many of the people who own Vermont's forest land, this is their asset. It is their portfolio for retirement. They don't have anything else. And so we need to make it profitable for them to own and hold land if we expect it to stay in the forest. So we spend a lot of time in the report talking about the forest economy, its components from forest, forest landowner, forester, logger, primary processing, the sawmills, secondary manufacturing that make value-added chairs and boards and floors and moldings and trim from logs, and then the craftspeople and the retailers. There's this incredibly complicated value chain in the forest economy. We try to explain what that is and where the strengths and weaknesses are because we need to pay attention to it. So there's a whole bunch of economic values that flow from this forest-based economy. Then we talk about the economics related, the economics of scenery, fall foliage, tourism, and recreation. So again, another economic piece that is very much tied to our forests. So right now, fall foliage. I'm taking calls from locally, statewide, regionally, nationally, internationally. And when I'm done, I'm talking to the Wall Street Journal about fall foliage. People are crazy for our leaves, okay? So it's 3.5 million visitors every fall that come to look at our trees, okay? $460 million, our last count, 2012 I think, of direct economic input from fall foliage tourism in like 6 weeks. 460 million. It's a quarter of Vermont's total tourism economy. And we don't paint the leaves, and right? They're beautiful, but it's in our forests. It depends on that. So this is a significant component of our economy. Then we get into the other aspects of recreation and tourism that are also related. So we make this case that forests are the scenic backdrop to this world-class tourism economy, and it's the natural infrastructure for our world-class outdoor recreation economy. Forest related, okay? Then we move on to this whole other category of benefits from forests. Things like they are maybe less well understood and appreciated, and certainly less quantifiable and monetized, but they are values nonetheless. So-called ecosystem services like flood protection, clean water, and clean air. These are real values that would otherwise cost us millions, hundreds of millions of dollars every year that we don't have to spend because we have forests doing it for us. New York City made a decision some years ago to forego a few $billions that it would have cost to build a new water treatment facility and instead conserved land in the Catskills, capitalizing on the natural infrastructure that is forests to provide clean water to Manhattan. Okay? That's a world-famous example of a world city deciding that forests are the answer to one of their significant economic problems. So it's more economics, just a little less well understood, but an emerging science of ecological economics. And we point to those values and make a case for them, and being that forest is just a good deal. It's the cheapest way to supply these benefits, and we're doing so. We also spend some time talking about the benefits for wildlife habitat, biodiversity, and connectivity. There's this basic responsibility that we have to provide for the other Vermonters. And so we spend some time talking about the role that forests play in providing that. And I think most of us have a good sense of that. It's one of the areas that the literature has the most expansive information on it. We try to draw from that and make that case. And we're not ashamed of that. It's important for us to acknowledge that we have that role and that forests are providing those benefits, as I say, to the other native Vermonters. Climate being so important, we pulled it out as its own feature. The role of forests in climate mitigation through carbon sequestration, storage, and also pointing to the threat that atmospheric carbon has on forest health. So that forests have this dual role, that we have to adapt and deal with the changes and as they influence forests and be prepared for that, but also know that forests are one of the best answers to the problem. And finding things like $16 million in air pollution removal. We're not paying that $16 million. The forest is doing it for us. And now there's this whole emerging body of literature and economic theory about the role of carbon as a market force. So we have this incredible advantage here, being a heavily forested state. We spent some time talking about that value. The last category of benefit and value that we get from forests, that we explain in the report, is kind of a broad one, and it's about our quality of life. This is why so many of us are here, because we enjoy this incredible quality of life. So human health, quality of life, and our cultural heritage, so tied to our forests. And we talk about everything from the traditional uses of forest land and for families, but also some human health connections. We know there's literature that talks about improved human health when people are near trees. It turns out trees are good, right? For all of us. So we recognize that. We did some work in trying to organize it and categorize it and make a case that beyond all that other stuff, it's just nice to live here because of forests in general and some human health benefits. And then we call out a particular aspect of Vermont's forests that we think deserve particular emphasis as a value, and that is this idea of forest blocks, forest habitat blocks. Building on the work of the Fish and Wildlife Department and their habitat analysis, this forest block analysis, these tend to be large, but not always large, areas of contiguous forest and other habitats that have, owing to a series of attributes, can be particularly powerful. So we wanted to make a case for that, and we draw attention to the forest habitat block that we've mapped them throughout the state, and yeah, again, it tends to be about size, big areas, but we really need to make sure we understand that because it's 11 different attributes of sort of ecological power contributing to these rankings, some of them are quite small. Clay plain forests in the Champlain Valley, for example, they're relatively small, but they have enormous value. So it's not just big areas, it's important areas, and the connectivity between and among them. So we spent some time talking about the value of forest blocks, large and small and connected. Healthy, intact forests. So it turns out, survey after survey shows that these values that I've just spent a little time describing in these several categories are not lost on Vermonters. People know this, and they have some sense of it anyway, and when they respond to these repeated surveys about the value of the working landscape, the value of the quality of life here, that, people get it, even if we don't necessarily show that we get it. We at least say we get it, and that's something to build on. So then we reset and say, okay, with that as backdrop, the forests of Vermont, the values of Vermont in these various categories. Remember, it's about healthy forests, the capacity for self-renewal, kind of a Leopoldian view of forest health, and integrity, which is having all the parts and pieces and getting back to this verb idea, that it's functioning properly. So that's the grail. That's what we're saying. All of those values that we can enumerate and describe are dependent on these things: healthy, intact forests, forest health, and forest integrity. That's what we're shooting for. So maintaining forest integrity requires connected forests. We're talking about facilitating mobility of organisms, and it strengthens our capacity to maintain forest health, which that gets us to the threat of fragmentation. And our charge was to define it, explore the causes and drivers, describe the existing conditions and the projected trends. And that's where the report goes from here. We'll spend a little time with it. To be clear, we're talking about the difference between an intact forest, a parcelized forest, which is an intact forest with multiple ownerships. So it's just lines on a map at this point of different owners. But the forest is still intact. It's what comes after that becomes pernicious, dangerous, threatening to the values that we just got done expressing. And that is perforated forest canopies, breaking forests into smaller pieces, essentially. That's fragmentation. So we have intact forest, parcelized forest, leading to fragmented, broken forests that have eroded function. So from one owner to many owners. It's 100 acres, now it's 10-acre lots. It's still 100 acres of forest, 10 different people with 10 different goals and objectives and needs and challenges, and that's where it starts to get interesting and a little bit tricky. Fragmentation is that next step, and we can show all kinds of slides here of examples of an intact, healthy forest, a few years later becoming not that. Largely in this pattern: linear infrastructure and residential development. One of the sort of classic examples of forest fragmentation. And we have many examples of this. I think you get it. I'm not going to dwell on it. So the picture is going from intact forest to broken forest. And here's an animation that really shows that it starts often with a road, linear infrastructure, and built environment around that. Going from, intact forest to, well, probably a really nice subdivision, but it's no longer providing those functions of forest. It's also just a really cool PowerPoint feature. So we try to dive into it a little bit, and there's a fair amount of literature on this concept of fragmentation. We didn't invent it, we didn't name it, and there's some theory, concepts, and principles that come with it. And that is really, we're talking about core or interior forest, where the highest function exists. And when you perforate that forest, you get this radiating effect, maybe 100 meters of radiating effect around every opening in the forest, where it's no longer interior forest. So every one of these housing developments has this disproportionate circle of a cascade of ill effects in the forest. So, I put it as this: there's a road, then there's a house, then there's cats and dogs, cats chasing birds, dogs chasing deer, and it's not interior forest anymore. Invasive plants moving through the woods, right? Eroding forest health, compromising forest function. And really what we're getting at is you get edge forest, not the same as interior forest, and then you have patch or fragments of forest, and that's the worst condition. When it goes from intact forest to kind of Swiss cheese, and when there's more holes than cheese, like we'd like to say, the whole sandwich suffers. So you work with me, people. I'm trying. We need a new lingo, right? So not to be forgotten is this concept of connectivity. That you need these core forests, and you need them to be connected. And so we keep that in the mix. Intact, healthy forests connected to one another. So we look at the causes and drivers, and we summarize them simply. Escalating property values. They're not making any more Vermont, but the values keep going up. So that's good, but it also brings some challenges. So increasing land values, increasing property taxes is a real disincentive for keeping forest. Conveyance of land from aging landowners, we mentioned that already, the intergenerational transfer, and then the pattern of land use that we are seeing dominant is exurbanization. This is rural sprawl. It's this idea of consuming land at a rate disproportionate to the number of people. We're just gobbling it up. And who can blame us, right? Who doesn't want to have their little piece of Vermont, a driveway into the woods, and I don't want to deal with, I don't live near Lewis, right? I want my own place, right? But that's what's happening, and we need to think about how that's happening.
You only live near me if you're related to me.
I've noticed that. We call it Porterville. Nice. So the mechanisms then really flow from those drivers. It leads to linear infrastructure, roads, power, septic, and sewer, that sort of built infrastructure in a linear way, and then the pattern of exurban sprawl, rural sprawl that results from that. That's the mechanism. And you can what leads to is a danger is you can drive around the state and feel pretty darn good about it. I mean, it is still forested and beautiful, but you can drive through heavily fragmented areas and not know it because it's this tunnel of green. And so this is a slide from Jens provided this, which is really telling, I think, and helpful that, this is a road, I feel okay using as an example from my town, that you drive along and it looks really great. It's trees everywhere, it's a green tunnel, but, you do the Google thing and you realize the red dot is that road, where we were on that road. And from above, we're driving down a road that looks quite forested, and it's not. I used to ski and hunt here, and I don't anymore, because it's no fun at all. It's just, it's over. It's not a forest, in my view, or in anyone's view, I don't think. It's a nice treed community, and we love our urban treescapes. But see, Steve, I did manage to say it.
Urban.
What? But urban, and this is exurban. Okay, that's really kind of a distinction here. And I don't mean to make light of it. We know that having people in urban areas connected with trees and green spaces actually helps with this other cause. And it's a connection from the downtown to the mountains of a green connection that we're seeking. And if you think that Vermont is not urban or doesn't have any urban issues and we don't have to care about the role of urban forests, let's talk further, because it's really key to holding this whole thing together, not to be goofy about it. So understand that it's complicated and it can be misleading, and I think this is just an attempt to help show that. We spent a little time in this section, the sort of sciencey section, explaining fragmentation, the concepts, and then we sort of make the point that all of the ill effects of fragmentation can really be traced back to two types of effects. Edge effects, that's the edge of forest against not forest, and how it, in an insidious way, creeps in and corrodes the health and function of the forest. And then there's the isolation effect, the lack of connectivity, forests being separated. So that's not good for critter movement or gene flow, but it's really not even good for our economic use, and it's definitely not good for our scenery and our recreation infrastructure, if you will. So edge effects and isolation effects are the two broad categories, and each of them can go in a bunch of different directions, but we sort of explained that. And then we went through, according to that same outline of benefits, we said, well, what are the impacts and effects of fragmentation on each of those categories of value and benefit? So, impacts of forest fragmentation on the forest economy, it's not good. I think the first bullet really sums it up. Practicing forestry, and we've already established that practicing forestry is A, not a fragmenting act, and it's B, one of our last best strategies for keeping forest, right? So practicing forestry becomes operationally impractical. It's too small. It just doesn't work. Trees are big, it takes some space. It's not viable impractical on small fragmented forests. It becomes operationally impractical, economically not viable, related to the first one, and culturally unacceptable. People don't want that stuff going on near them. And so this is like the unholy trinity of the failing forest economy. And it's a direct effect of a fragmented forest. We have emerging needs. We are in the newly drafted Comprehensive Energy Plan, for example. We're promoting intelligent use of wood for our energy future, for modern wood heating, clean, efficient use of locally produced wood to heat. We live in a cold place. Heating is a big deal. Getting off of fossil fuels, improving our climate situation, and supporting the forest economy. That's not going to happen in a fragmented Vermont. It's not. It's a really key piece of our future. We're sanguine about it, But this fragmentation, this land use pattern totally threatens that, our ability to grow this wood energy economy. Similarly, I don't think I have to spend a lot of time saying that if we fragment this forest, we lose our competitive advantage as a destination for scenery, tourism, and outdoor recreation. Right? Whether they're coming to look at leaves or to fish in our streams or hunt in our woods, when it's fragmented, we're just like anyone else. We lose our competitive advantage. And I think that's the point I would make here, folks. All of these benefits, right? We can't outsource these. These are unique benefits to Vermont, and Vermont is small, and we can't compete in other ways. This is our competitive advantage, is this landscape, this beautiful, healthy, functioning landscape. So all of these values are threatened, and we walk through that and explain why we don't want to be outsourcing these values because we can't, then it all falls apart. This was relatively easy, the connection of forests and clean water supply. I happened to be presenting this to the legislature at a time when they were seriously engaged in water quality issues, and it was quite fun saying, I understand it's a challenge to clean up Lake Champlain. Try doing it without healthy forested hillsides. Not going to happen, right? And that really got some attention. So this one was relatively low-hanging fruit, to make the case for the role of forests in the hydrologic cycle and how it is so profoundly important to water supply as well as water quality, and then everything we depend on from there. Similarly, we make the case for fragmentation will have a direct negative effect on the forest role in climate mitigation, flood resiliency, etc. The literature, the scientific literature, is really filled. It is relatively filled. There's the most information on the effects of fragmentation on wildlife habitat and biodiversity. It's significant. We borrowed from it heavily and tried to make that case. That it's well understood. Fragmented habitats are not healthy habitats, and they don't function as well. And then similarly, the reduction in human health benefits, increased incidence of Lyme disease. We found this one-sided report of reduced biodiversity in forests equals increased incidence of Lyme disease in humans. So a direct connection between fragmentation and human health. Loss of this rural nature that Vermonters value, and is kind of our stock in trade, our brand. So it's threatening the underpinnings, the cultural underpinnings of what makes Vermont Vermont. If we don't pay attention to the health of our forests and keep them intact. So we make that case that what the forests, value of our forests, the patterns of fragmentation, how it works, the causes and drivers, and then we'll say living communities, livable communities, functioning natural systems, and the quality of life of Vermonters rely on maintaining large blocks of contiguous forest across the landscape. That's our point. And we're going to say then, therefore, we have a time now, heavily forested, enjoying innumerable benefits, and our decisions and actions today clearly will influence the forests and the benefits that Vermonters of the future get to enjoy. So let's pay attention. We're basically saying, if you buy that forests matter, just simply ask, do you think we have the legal, the economic, the institutional frameworks in place to ensure that those benefits will continue? I've asked this question repeatedly for 6 months, traveling the state. Nobody's raised their hand yet, saying, yeah, we have the tools and strategies and tactics in place to protect, to just give us even some hope that those values will continue. That's kind of significant. And that's what leads us to the policy options that we've laid out. And Deb described as sort of 5 categories of policies: education outreach, targeted enhanced land conservation with respect to forest blocks, landowner incentives, land use planning, regulatory, and sustainable forestry, and the forest economy, support for those. So given that we have our team here to discuss what we're thinking about in each of these kind of policy buckets, I'll just jump sort of through, acknowledge that most of these, some of them we're doing now and doing them well. We need to keep doing those, maybe do some of them a little differently. And others of these are not necessarily all new, and we didn't think them up. People have been struggling with these things, and so we're borrowing from everywhere we can. We've engaged in a stakeholder process, traveling the state, getting input, and we're collecting ideas for each of these to put forth to the legislature, because that's where this report went. They said, come back and tell us what we should do about it. And that's the next best opportunity we have. We had this chance to make this case. They heard the case and said, come back in January 16 and give us a list of recommendations, policy recommendations for legislative change in support of forest integrity. We've organized our thinking along these categories. Pardon me, I'm going to just jump through them really quickly so then we can talk about them more fully. Those 5. I'm going to leave it here because I think, well, for one, I'm a forester and it's not possible for me to give a presentation without including a Leopold quote. This one, I think, among many, is one of the better ones because it makes the point that I think is really important for me here. This isn't about closing the borders or shutting down growth and development. This is really about intelligent thinking. Our message here is not stop growth. It's about, well, intelligent growth and thinking about it carefully. That's what we really want to see, and that's what we think this policy development should be about. Is how do we get it right? Protecting these values and have a system in place that allows us to do it all. So I'll pause there, and we'll go. Shall we just move on to each of you guys?
First of all, aren't we so lucky that he's our advocate?